Malifaux is actually a pretty inexpensive game to get into. If you're just looking to pick up some models, it's got a pretty low model count, so you can pretty much buy a box or two and be ready to put them down on the table and get a game in. If you want to know a little bit more about what to buy in terms of models, then check out this video here. But with that all being said, there's a whole bunch of other things that you might want to buy in order to enhance your games or make it a little bit easier to do certain things in the game. Some of these things are actually relatively important, and some of these things are not really important at all. They're just kind of conveniences or luxuries that people like to have, but are absolutely not necessary for a new player who's just getting into the game. So let's talk accessories. The first thing you're going to need in addition to your models is going to be a fate deck. Now, if you're looking to save as much money as possible, then you can actually just play Malifaux with a poker deck as long as it has the 2 jokers in it. But it requires you to convert the suits over to the Malifaux suits, which can be a little bit of a pain. So I think a real fate deck is a good option just in terms of utility, but also in terms of theme, because a lot of the fate decks that are out there are very cool. You can pick one up that goes along with your faction, as well as a bunch of other special versions that have different art styles and all kinds of cool stuff. Plus, they've been putting these fate decks out for years, so if you go on eBay or Facebook Marketplace, you can probably find a whole bunch of other cool and interesting fate decks. I have about 1,000,000 of them in my house because I've been collecting Malifaux for a long time. So you can also try asking some of your opponents if you have a good Malifaux scene near you, and maybe some of them have some old ones laying around that they wouldn't mind lending to you. Next up is going to be a measuring tool. Now, this is kind of a staple for any wargamer. If you're coming over from a different system, then you probably have measuring tapes or these little measuring widgets that a lot of people like to use in order to measure distances in the game. None of this is special to Malifaux. You just need something that can measure inches. But there are definitely both companies as well as like Etsy stores that make custom measuring widgets, which can be pretty handy because it can be a little bit more precise when you're trying to measure 1 inch or 2 inches or something like that. The one that comes with the Malifaux star boxes is also convenient because it has a little 50mm circle for you to measure things like blast, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The next thing, and this is actually something that I would recommend even for new players, is dry erase markers and sleeves for your cards. Now, sleeves are something that a lot of people like to put on their cards anyway just to protect them from wear and tear because they're going to get handled a lot while you're playing. But the important thing here is that a dry erase marker will allow you to mark damage on your model and then erase it when the game is over. Now, you'll know that you can actually manage all of that type of stuff in the Malifaux app, which is really easy and convenient, and it's free. But I personally like to use the cards themselves, and I think it's a little bit easier to just fill in the little circles with the dry erase marker, and then when I heal a model, I can just wipe it off and continue playing. It's a little bit faster and more seamless, and it's also easier to reference at a glance when I just look at the cards in front of me. But that's up to personal preference. Not everybody's going to want to use the cards at all. Next are condition tokens. So there are a variety of conditions that can affect your models in Malifaux, and you need a way to track all of this. Now, just as I mentioned with tracking your damage, you can track conditions on the Malifaux app, but again, a lot of people prefer to track them in real life because it's a little easier to just look at and know exactly what's going on at a glance. There's a couple of different ways that people do this. One way is to just use the dry erase marker to write near the art for the character on the card what the condition is. So you can just write in focus 1. And then when the condition goes away, you can just wipe it off. Simple as that. Another option is to use little tokens that represent the condition, and you can put them either next to the model or on the cards. Now, I think that's the best option because I think it's the easiest for you to reference as the player, but it's also a little bit easier for your opponent to see because it's just as important that they know the condition of your models as it is for you to know. And you don't want to have a situation where they didn't realize that one of your models had a condition that sort of changes what they were going to do in the game. Now, once again, there's a bunch of companies that make condition tokens for Malifaux, and there's also Etsy stores and things like that. But in addition to all that, if you or someone you know has a 3D printer or a laser cutter, then you can make them yourself. Now, there's a variety of circumstances in which you might need to put down a marker on the board to represent something in-game in Malifaux. The most common example of something like that would be a scheme marker, which is something that you put down in order to score points for certain objectives in the game. And certain strategies are also going to require that you put down markers before the game even starts to represent the objectives that you're trying to accomplish throughout the game. In addition, things like shockwaves will require you to put down a marker, and typically these are going to be 30mm markers unless it specifies otherwise. Now, there's a couple of different options that you have for a 30mm marker. The faction starter boxes actually come with 30mm markers that you can use for a variety of different things. But in addition to that, you'll notice that the smallest size base in Malifaux is 30mm. So if you have a whole bunch of extra bases laying around, you can use these for any of those different options. And then like with everything else, there are a variety of retailers as well as Etsy stores and things like that where you can find 30mm markers to be used for anything you want. And again, I would say that this is something that is relatively important because you're going to need these to run most of the strategies and schemes in the games as well as a variety of other things. So this is probably high on the priority list of accessories to pick up, even if you're trying to stick to a budget. Now, on a similar note, but not necessarily sticking to the 30mm base size, There are a variety of game effects that are going to generate different types of markers. Now, this is something that you're going to know based on the abilities that you have on the models in your crew. But certain models will actually create things like shadow markers or ice pillars or underbrush markers. And these are contextual based on the crew, and it will tell you exactly what those things do, as well as whether they're 30mm, 40mm, or 50mm. Now, sometimes they will have characteristics that allow models to walk over them, which means that having something that is relatively low profile will be very convenient, because it's not going to be as hard to physically put a model on top of it. But others will have a height as well as a blocking characteristic, which means that models can't walk past it, in which case you can use anything that is the right diameter. And same with the 30mm markers. There are bases in Malifaux that are 40mm as well as 50mm, and you can buy markers from a variety of different places that will serve these purposes. I actually had a buddy of mine who has a laser cutter make up some pyre markers as well as ice pillars out of this thin acrylic, which is pretty nice because sometimes you end up with a whole bunch of these on the board, and it can be a little bit of a mess if you use something bigger. It might be a good idea to keep a 50mm marker handy just in case you ever have an ability that lets you do a blast. Without getting too far into the details of what that means, when you create a blast, you actually need a 50mm marker that can measure the other models that would be affected by the blast. And the measuring widget that comes in the starter boxes gives you a 50mm circle, but if you have a large base from a model on a 50mm base, you can also just use that. Now, another handy quality of life upgrade for a game of Malifaux is a strategies and schemes deck. Every year or so, Weird puts out a new set of strategies and schemes, which are the objectives you're going to play in the game. And they kind of get updated and revised to change up the meta and kind of keep things interesting for players. Now, if you have a really good memory or you just like using the app, then you don't necessarily need cards to represent those strategies and schemes, but it can be really nice to get the deck of cards so it's a little easier to reference them while you're playing the game. It can be kind of confusing to keep up with the 6 different objectives that are in play at any given time in a full game of Malifaux, so having those cards handy to reference can be really nice. And there's 2 options to pick up a strategies and schemes deck. One is sold directly through Weird, and the other is on Wargame Vault, who sells all of the single cards for Malifaux if you ever need to replace a card or buy an updated card because an errata changed it. Now, the next thing you're definitely going to need to play a game of Malifaux is some terrain. Now, this might not be a huge concern for you if you're playing at a local game store that supplies terrain to you, but if you don't, then you're going to need some stuff to put out on the table to represent terrain and kind of break things up a little bit for while you're playing. Of course, you could go old school and just use things from around the house like books and salt and pepper shakers and lipstick and all kinds of cool stuff like that. But if you want something that's going to look a little bit more thematic and be a little bit more functional, then there's a whole bunch of options out there for terrain. The first thing you could do is you could build some terrain yourself. And this can be a really fun project, especially if you're into the craftier side of this hobby. There's a whole bunch of different YouTube channels out there that can give you tutorials on how to build a variety of different types of terrain. And I'll put a couple of my favorites up here so that you can check them out. I really like working on terrain projects, but they can be a lot of work, and they're definitely a little bit messy, so keep that in mind before you give them a try. Another option would be to buy terrain from companies that make the terrain themselves, and this can come in a variety of different forms. Some of the common ones are plastic sets, where you cut the terrain out on sprues very similar to a model, put them together, and paint them yourself. Another one would be MDF terrain, which is like very thin wood that's usually laser cut, and then you have to cut it out and glue it together, and sometimes that will come painted and sometimes it won't. And another common type would be foam board, which is like the stuff that you probably did some school projects on when you were a kid. And similarly, that might come in a pre-painted or a not pre-painted form. Now, each of these types of terrain has their own advantages and disadvantages, and there's a ton of companies out there that make it. So I think I'm actually going to do some separate videos talking about different types of terrain and what their pros and cons are, so stay tuned for that in the future. But the third option for getting some terrain together would be 3D printing. So if you happen to have a 3D printer, there's a ton of different places out there, both paid and free, to get files to make terrain for the game. 3D printing is kind of a hobby in and of itself, so if that's not something you're already into, then I don't recommend that. If you're just getting into wargaming, then stick to buying it or making it yourself. 3D printing is really useful, but it can be a real pain if you're not super into that already. Now, one of the cool things about the setting of Malifaux is that you don't really have to target a specific style of terrain when you're putting together your collection. In a lot of games, there's like specific terrain that kind of works for that setting, and you can't really deviate from that, either because of the rules or because of the restrictions of the setting and the lore, where it wouldn't really look right if you put the characters in a different setting. But in Malifaux, there's such a variety of different types of terrain and different settings that there's not really much that you could do wrong for a game of Malifaux. I would say that you want to probably steer away from really, really large pieces of terrain. Sometimes for games like Warhammer 40k, where they play out on a larger table, you can get a piece of terrain that will take up a little bit too much room on a Malifaux table. But honestly, you could make that work if you really needed to. And as far as themes go, you can do anything from a medieval town to a jungle or a swamp, plains, a western theme, volcanoes, snowy landscape. It kind of runs the gambit. The only thing that might not look super appropriate would be a super futuristic, especially if it's like a very clean aesthetic, futuristic looking game. So like Infinity Terrain maybe wouldn't look perfect in a game of Malifaux, but you could bend the rules a little bit and make that work even. Plus, if you haven't had that stuff, then don't worry too much about if it's correct for the theme. If that's the way that you can play the game, then play the game that way. But going along with terrain, another thing that you might want to pick up would be a mat to play the game on. Now, of course, this is entirely optional. You can just play on your kitchen table if it's the right size. Maybe just figure out a way to block off a 3x3 area so everybody knows where the boundaries of the map are. But it can be pretty convenient to have a mat to lay out, both because then it's very clear where the board ends, and it also looks pretty cool, especially if you have some nice terrain to put on top of it. Now, one nice thing is that there are a variety of companies out there that make mats in all kinds of different sizes, and some of them will even put lines on the map to represent different important things for a game of Malifaux, such as deployment zones or the areas where your objectives are going to get scored. That could be really cool, especially if Malifaux is the primary game that you play. But again, that's entirely unnecessary, and if you want to just get a plain old map that's 3x3, or even a little bit bigger, then you can do that, and you can kind of keep it available to play other games on as well. Now, another really important thing when you're getting into this hobby is to consider a carrying solution. So especially once your collection of models starts to grow a little bit more, it can be a little bit cumbersome to try to transport all of them and keep them safe, because obviously we don't want to break our pretty little models. There's a bunch of different things that you can do to transport your models, and one very popular one would be foam trays. Now, there's a bunch of options for that out there, but a common one would be pluck foam, where you can actually size the little compartments to the specific model and make sure that they fit in there nice and comfortably. But the downside to a foam tray, especially for a game like Malifaux, is that a lot of the models are very irregular shaped, and they have legs and bits that stick off in different directions. And when you're moving them in and out of the tray, sometimes they can be prone to break. So what I do, and what a lot of other folks do, is use magnets. Now, this is going to take a little bit more prep and a little bit more doing, but it can be a really good solution for holding your stuff securely without worrying too much about breaking it by accident. All you got to do is stick a magnet in the bottom of the base of the model, and then find some magnetic surface that you can stick them to inside of a tray. You can either attach a metal sheet to the bottom of some sort of carrying case, or you can do what I do and get magnet rolls, which are like a flexible material that are slightly magnetic, and then you can glue those down to the bottom of a container. The nice thing about that is that the magnets don't stick quite as strongly to it, so you don't have to worry about accidentally breaking the model off the base when you try to pick it up. So be wary of that if you're going to actually use a piece of metal. There are also companies that make magnet trays that are specifically for this purpose, and even have cases that they can go inside. My experience with those has not been great, but I know there are some people who really prefer that style. Now, I've also seen carrying trays that have little indents in them where the bases will just sort of sink into a little notch, and that is the way that you're supposed to carry the models around. And I've never used something like that myself, although I know they are pretty popular in other game systems, so that might be an option for you as well. But if you only have a couple of models and you don't mind just carrying them around in a little box, be careful with it, but I think that's probably totally fine. This is something you really got to worry about once your collection gets a little bigger and you need a way to store and transport them. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is maybe the most optional on this whole list, and that is a widget to use to track things like your score, your soulstone count, and the turn number. Now, I've seen this type of thing come in a whole variety of different types, but these are usually little 3D printed or laser cut pieces that you can use to just keep track of certain things. So you can keep track of your own as well as your opponent's scores and the number of soulstones you have left in your soulstone pool. Sometimes they will have a spinner, or you'll stick a die in a particular spot and then rotate it when you need to change the number. Now, these are really fun, and they can be a really useful way to stay organized and make sure you stay on top of those things, because you don't want to forget any of those numbers. But I find that just using a die for them is totally adequate, and you don't necessarily need this little widget, so it really is just a thing that you get for fun. And to count my soulstones, I actually went and bought these little gems at a craft store because I thought they were cool, and I keep these to keep track of my soulstone count, because then it feels like I'm actually using a soulstone when I put one of them back in the box. Again, obviously, you totally don't have to do that. You can just use a die that has a number on it and just turn it down when you're changing the number. And also, all of this stuff gets tracked in the app as well. So if you prefer to use the app, then you don't have to worry about any of it. So that is a bunch of different types of accessories that you might need to get into the game of Malifaux. If you have a favorite accessory or a favorite option for one of these types of accessories, then put it in the comments below and let everybody know so they can check it out for themselves. If you think it would be helpful for me to do a deeper dive into any one of these categories, then let me know that as well. I think I'm already going to start doing a series on different types of terrain and what I think their advantages and disadvantages are, because I have a pretty extensive terrain collection and I like to make some for myself. So I think that might be useful for folks out there. But let me know what you think. If you like this video and found it helpful, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss all that cool stuff coming up. And check out the links in the description below for things like my Weird affiliate link if you're going to make some purchases through Weird's website. It gives me a little kickback when you do, as well as the merch store where you can pick up some Defective Dice merchandise, and the Patreon where you can support me directly and get all sorts of different benefits, including early access to videos and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'd like to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Devin, and the Spilled Paint Pot, and thanks for watching.